This is the
Five Stars
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. What do you guys want to talk about?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. Leave it to AEW to promote a hot world title match in their main event, and they still wind up managing to piss me off by the time the show's over. Guess that's to be expected at this point. And after 3 years of this, still haven't learned my lesson apparently. Set the bar as low as humanly possible. Maybe someday I'll figure it out. Maybe by then AEW will figure it out too. But I highly doubt it. Watching this week's Dynamite, I kept thinking back to my Full Gear recap I did a month or so back. Was it Full Gear? I think it was Full Gear. Where I said, thank God for MJF. The only true redeeming quality on that entire pay-per-view. That was pretty much the same thing that rattled through my brain after this show was over. Thank God for MJF, dude. You know, Ricky Starks played a role in that too. Somehow in that cesspool of raw sewage, there are still a couple of rose petals hanging out. They're very rare and hard to come by in AEW anymore, but when they show up, they make sure to make it obvious. So we'll get into the Dynamite report in a minute. Won't take a whole lot of time to go over because my notes are minutely finite. Before we do that, though, if you are checking out the Five Starr Wrestling Report podcast for the first time, make sure to subscribe, like the show, comment, all the good stuff that makes the world go round. Be it on YouTube or Rumble. If you're watching on Rumble, you know, it's funny, I've had the account for about a year now, and I still don't know what the icons mean. There's like some kind of function for a rating system. I don't think they do subscriptions over there. I don't know if they call it followers or whatever, or if they just call it rumblers, but whatever. You can catch the show over on Rumble if you prefer alternate platforms. Quite frankly, I don't blame you in this day and age. We've also got the retro material that we're going to get into today as well. I really would like to get the AEW stuff out of the way as quickly as possible because didn't really have a whole lot of insightful input to give about that show this week. Low effort on their end equals low effort on my end. They want to produce crap for the most part. I'll give them a crap review as a result. At least I know we're both on the same page that way. It's mutual. You know, it's funny too, because I still always think to myself, man, you know, maybe I'm being too harsh on AEW. Am I just being unfair in my criticism of their product? Then I think about it more and I'm like, no, it's purely justified. Every opinion that I've had about that product for the better part of 3 years now, they always manage to bring me back to the same thought by the time the show's over. You know, I think after what I said on last week's show about the state of AEW as a whole right now, it should kind of give you a perspective on where I stand with everything. I'll try not to raise my voice as much here because that's not really my flavor, but sometimes I just get sent over the edge with the stupidity, and well, AEW really tested me with a lot of the stuff they put on the show Wednesday night, especially when it came to the stupidity. All right, so let's get going with this Winter is Coming edition. And winter may be coming, but I'll tell you what I wasn't coming to see was match 4 of the Romp and Roll session with the Elite and Death Triangle, and whatever that little beat-off session as they're having over the trios titles at the moment. Already said it before, don't care, don't want to see it, never wanted to see it. And now that I know match 5 is going to be a no DQ, anything goes, garbage outlaw match with weapons, that'll give me another perfect excuse to not partake in that debauchery. So that was the first half hour of the program right there. Luckily, I was still in a good enough mood for not having subjected myself to the opening match, where I could watch an MJF promo in full and be satisfied by the end. And obviously, I don't need to fill you in with the palpable details that MJF cut another great promo. You reference here that he came into AEW hitting home run after home run, and now he's batting at well over 1,000. And this is just another example in showcasing that. It was good, though. He talked about how everyone was referring to Ricky Starks' promo last week as a star-making performance, and while that's all cute, MJF was a star the moment he stepped foot in AEW. He said that Ricky's been projecting the hard times upbringing on everybody, when the reality is that none of it matters, because the only thing that matters is who is the AEW World Champion. To which one audience member audibly yelled, "No, it's not." And I had a nice belly laugh at that interjection. Make sure that one's on the next Botchamania compilation. And of course, he's going off about being born with the silver spoon in his mouth and that he makes no apologies for being fucking great. But when it comes to pressure, it's all on Ricky Starks tonight. MJF is already the guy, so he has nothing left to prove and no one to let down. But for Starks, he's got the whole world behind him. All the fans, all his friends and family, and God. And after tonight, we're going to find out whether or not that crushed pebble turns into a diamond or turns to dust. Thought about it before. If only we had 50 other guys on the roster that could cut as halfway a decent promo as him, the show would be like watching NWA Studio Wrestling all over again. I wouldn't even care how piss poor the matches would be a lot of the time. I just wish the boys knew how to fucking talk and deliver convincing material like MJF does. Instead, everybody's apparently content with being mid. Speaking of mid, Jeff Jarrett. You know, it's frustrating. It really is. I don't hate Jeff Jarrett. He sounds like a nice guy. He sounds like he's got his head screwed on straight. I understand he's got family lineage in the business and he respects the old school mentality when it comes to wrestling. But there are only so many ways I can say, get your fucking overrated POS ass off my television before it starts coming across as vindictive. I think I've reached my breaking point now. At the very least, I'm growing supremely impatient having to sit through all this. And look, I understand the Acclaim need new opponents to wrestle for the tag belts. Jay Lethal and Jeff Jarrett, in an ideal world, would be the two perfect opponents for them to work a program with to gain experience from. But I'm sorry. It all goes back to the Jeff Jarrett thing. I just can't overlook anything I've ever said about him previously when it comes to him as an on-screen talent at this point. Maybe this would have worked 10 or so years ago when Jeff was a little younger and the whole WCW TNA stain hadn't been left. But in 2022, the only role that I would tolerate a Jeff Jarrett taking at this point is some kind of backstage agent / executive role. Not as an in-ring competitor and not as somebody who's soaking up screen time and smashing guitars over dudes' heads. It was old when it was happening in the late 90s. It was older when he was doing it in TNA about 10 years later in front of smaller crowds and lesser name power. Now it's just fucking retarded. It's no longer heel heat with me, or anyone for that matter. These boos are not generating the right kind of heat. These boos are not going to entice people to want to pay money to see the Acclaimed get their revenge on Lethal and Jarrett. It's the droning, oh God, please no reaction. It's what I think we used to call X-Pac heat. The we don't want to see you, go away and never come back kind of heat. Translation, the wrong kind of heat. Like I said, the Acclaimed do need to work with experienced veterans that know what they're doing. But you know what? At the same time, they also need to work with a set of heels that we can take seriously and haven't been made to look like complete buffoons on television. I don't even know what the stable with Dutt, Lethal, Jarrett, and Kali 2.0 is, but if they don't have a name, it should just be called the TNA Rejects. Because that's all this is. Let's be frank about it. They've been a joke faction since the beginning. They never won any featured matches to my recollection. Didn't they lose to Darby and Sting at the last pay-per-view? What the hell happened with that? And all of a sudden, Darby's getting jobbed out to Samoa Joe on television and Sting's MIA? See, this is the kind of shit when people are talking about the genius of Tony Khan's booking, all I do is laugh. Because it's absurd. Any sane, rational person would look at Tony's track record of booking just in this year alone and think, what are these people smoking? Why are Jarrett and Lethal getting a title shot when they just lost their last pay-per-view match? And if you try to hit me with the, well, they won a handful of matches on Dark Elevation. Dude, fuck off. Seriously. So that segment was stupid. Speaking of stupid, Brian Cage wrestled Jungle Boy in a god-awful, horrendous match. I've used the cliche, look like a monkey trying to fuck a football, and that's probably a disrespect to monkeys after having watched this match. Monkeys have more coordination than Brian Cage. Do I even need to break anything down? Where do you even start? The bad lucha spots where Cage takes a Hurricane Rana and then awkwardly runs an extra 10 to 15 steps just to hit the corner buckle? Or how about the choppy strikes and kicks that look like he's doing that shit in slow motion? Or how about him recklessly dumping Jungle Boy over his head and then dropping him right on the side of his face? Or the German overhead throw where he narrowly missed dumping Jungle Boy on his fucking head? Seriously, what the hell am I missing about Brian Cage? He's a genetic freak that wrestles a video game style of match. He's all moves, most of which never makes a goddamn lick of sense, and whenever he's in there wrestling a guy who's as green as he is, it doesn't do him any favors. I mean, Jungle Boy's at least showed promise when he's in there wrestling competent workers. Cage hasn't even shown that. God, that guy's the shits. And he's still milking a paycheck out of this company after, 2.5 years now? Wasn't there a period of time where he was just off of television? Why did Tony decide to bring him back? I don't get it. I also love the incredibly botched finish where Jungle Boy and Cage are doing the do-si-do while Prince Nana's on the ring apron, and when Cage went to do the clothesline spot where he knocked the manager off the apron, he had to run with his arm extended because it was going to take him an extra 20 steps just to make fucking contact with the guy. What an idiot. Horrible match. They called the show Winter is Coming, so I guess it was apropos. A match that was so iceberg cold it fit perfectly with the theme of the program. Maybe that was a clever tactic on Tony's part. I don't know. So at this point, I started fast-forwarding through a lot of bullshit. There were several pre-tapes that didn't look all that interesting to me. And when I learned that the next scheduled match on the show was the House of Drek versus The Factory, I wrote down in my notes, 300 goddamn wrestlers under contract, and this is the best of the best AEW has to offer approaching the top of the hour. QT Marshall. Yeah, that guy's putting asses in seats. And I guess since this was AEW's Sabotage edition of Dynamite, the show where they were actively looking to run off as many viewers as possible before the MJF Ricky Starks main event match, they actually booked a Chris Jericho squash match at the top of hour 2. Air quotes around that because it turned out to be everything but a squash by the time it was over. I'm not kidding. He wrestled some dweeb named Action Andrade or something like that. I thought Andrade was on the witness protection list. Whoever this guy was, he's probably 5'6" at the most, painfully thin, probably $140 if you dipped him in molasses. The most generic-looking physique you've ever seen. The fucking 18-year-old high school bad haircut. Couldn't pick him out of a police lineup. I mean, you run the whole gamut of metaphors. It was all applicable here. And not only did this rib go through a commercial break, but they were actually having the jobber get visual pins and kickouts on Chris Jericho. Little did I know it was about to come in the finish. Okay, seriously, let's back up for a minute. Who the fuck was this guy? Have we ever seen or heard of him prior to this show? Why the hell is he having a competitive back and forth TV match with Chris fucking Jericho in the middle of Dynamite after one match? And moreover, beating him. He won. They put the job guy over Chris Jericho. Clean. What the fuck? The debuting job guy who looked like he couldn't beat up a 14-year-old girl convincingly is getting clean pinfall victories over a former multi-time world champion? Some indie geek we've never seen or heard of prior to this segment? Who does this? You have 299 other guys on the roster you could have showcased in this spot. Young guys that you've actually had for a while that could really use that rub. Guys that you've put in featured spots before but have needed the major wins to boost them over the edge. Dante Martin, Brian Pillman Jr., Jungle Boy, Darby Allin, Sammy Guevara, The Guns, Hook, Powerhouse Hobbs, Ricky Starks. What was that thing AEW was promoting on their website, the 4 pillars of the company? I mean, I think I rattled off a few of those names that were on there, allegedly. And you chose this fucking clown? I'm not even particularly gung-ho about all the names I just rattled off. I was just shooting off a bunch of names that came to mind. You've had Jericho beat guy after guy after guy after guy after guy on television, week after week after week after week after week. Some of those being notable names, too. Former Ring of Honor World Champions, main event players in other promotions like Tomohiro Ishii. And you chose this guy to get the upset 1-2-3 Kid Flash pin. Newsflash, numbnuts. This kid ain't the 1-2-3 Kid. And he never will be. More than likely, judging by the way Tony books, this will be the last time you see of him until he decides to bring him back on TV 6 months from now. And he'll probably lose clean then, too. I mean, what more is to say about this joke of a segment? Other than the fact that you can't rationally look at something like this and not think this is a premeditated attempt to run off viewers. They were trying to ensure that people turn the show off before the MJF Starks main event. That's all there was to read into this. It was a fucking joke, an abomination of a TV segment, complete waste of time. Everything about it was intentionally designed to make sure people tune the show off in droves. Now, the real question is, once we figure out what the ratings breakdowns are, did it succeed? Did Chris Jericho and the Elite successfully sabotage MJF's first world title defense in AEW? That'll be the ultimate testament to how great MJF is. I mean, most people are only tuning in to watch his stuff anyway because virtually everything else on the show is the drizzling shites, including Jericho's bullshit. Case in point here. Ridiculous segment. Whoever signed off on it needs to be immediately fired. Whether that's Jericho or Tony or some combination of them, I don't care. But this was absolutely atrocious television. If their end goal was to turn off half the viewers in disgust, they may have accomplished that. And if that winds up hurting the MJF Starks main event as a result, then every single one of these piss ants can go sodomize themselves with a rubber hose. Dickwads. So, said I wasn't going to yell. I tried. So at this point, they showed a VTR of the Briscoes FTR dog collar match from the Ring of Honor pay-per-view. The same match that, yes, got about 3 days of build on television after FTR just lost in last week's main event. I still have not watched that match yet. Don't know if I plan on doing so or not. Regardless, apparently FTR is now moving on to feuding with the Ass Boys. So they've gone from the Acclaimed to the third series match with the Briscoes to now they're back to feuding with an underneath tag team in AEW. And I love Austin and Colton, but come on now. Seriously? This is the rotation they're putting FTR through in the tag division right now? I mean, this would be like having the Midnights feud with the Fantastics and then feuding them with Ricky and Robert and then following that with having them work with Sam Houston and George South. Good workers, but I mean, nowhere near the level of the other two teams. I mean, I'm sure the match will be fine, but gosh, just so disappointed to see how far FTR have fallen in the last year. I really hope to God they don't re-sign their contracts when they come due because they've earned so much more than what AEW is willing to give to them at this stage. Like, let them go. Let them do their own thing and no handcuffs. Because obviously they're stuck with whatever they're getting in AEW right now, which is not a lot based on the way they've been booked. So in more efforts to kill the ratings, Ty Mello wrestled Ruby Riott. And again, if the goal was to drive off viewers, well, AEW's had a great track record of doing so when it comes to the girls' segments. I mean, by this point, though, with how horrible the show was, I highly doubt this did any further damage. But you know what? Enough of that crap. Let's talk about the only thing on the show worth caring about. It's a shame they didn't spend more time really building up to this on television because after last week's promo face-off with Starks and MJF, this earned more TV attention than what they gave it. So, here's the deal. I was really pissed by the time we got here in the show. Everything I had seen up to this point was mostly dreck, and I tried to clear my mind before this match so I had even the slightest chance of enjoying it. I'm still of the mentality that they should have stretched this program out for several more weeks, try to make this an actual storyline feud instead of their typical one-and-done blow-off / let's move on to the next thing that a lot of these title programs in AEW seem to follow. You know, with MJF and Starks, that is a program you could actually elongate for a period of time and get some mileage out of over the long term. You know, and they may still do that based on the way the finish went, but we'll talk about that in a bit. So I really didn't jot a whole lot down about the actual match because I just kind of wanted to watch it in a vacuum and see what I was able to retain after the fact. Not focusing so much on the note-taking, but taking the time to actually watch and view it as a fan. Because it's not often I have the opportunity to really do that in AEW. And here's what I'll say. I'm trying to be open-minded and impartial in my review. Was this a technical masterpiece from start to finish? No. Were there moments here where it seemed like both guys weren't really clicking or on the same page with one another? Yes. Would I say this was either MJF or Ricky Starks' strongest showing in the ring? No. But let me tell you why I think this worked. Because despite some of the botches, some of the work not being the cleanest or crispest, the overall layout and structure of the match did work. It was well done to where you could look past some of the more iffy moments and analyze the match in terms of the drama and story. Was there drama here? Yes. Did both guys do a good job working the crowd and getting everybody invested in what they were doing? Yes. Was there a clear-cut villain, a clear-cut protagonist, and a story they laid out from the onset? Yes. The story was that MJF thought Ricky Starks couldn't handle the pressure. He believed that Ricky was way in over his head and that he was going to fall flat on his face and fail because he couldn't handle the spotlight. He just didn't have what it takes. His first real break as a potential main eventer, and he believed Starks was never going to be able to hold up to his end of the bargain. And as it turns out, it gave the people that much more of a reason to support Ricky here, because they understood that what MJF said about Ricky, or this being his first real break, it's true. You know, he was wasted potential for the better part of 2 years, and because the people have seen Ricky shine before, they know the guy can talk. They know the guy has a great old school personality. They know the guy obviously has something. We've just been waiting to see it. And while it's hard to look past the shitty booking and the mistreatment of the guy for so long, this was Starks' actual first major opportunity to show what he's made of in a main event picture. Now, did he knock it out of the park? Probably not. Was this something I'd show to the boys in wrestling class if I was trying to find a match to describe how you piece together a perfectly executed world title main event? No. This probably wouldn't rank among even like the top 50 matches I would show. But again, it's important to remember that wrestling, historically speaking, has never been about the moves. You know, that's a modern thing with how the idiots grade whether or not a wrestling match was good or not. The moves are not the draw of the match. What draws is the story behind why two guys are fighting. What draws are the two personalities engaging in said fight. What draws is the people's wanting to see if that good guy beat the bad guy and overcome all of the obstacles put in his way. So it's important to remember that. I can't say this was a great match, or probably wouldn't even go out of my way to say it was a very good match. But was it effective? Did it accomplish everything it needed to in the end? Yes. It's not to be sitting here and trying to make a BS defense mechanism for Ricky and MJF because, again, I've seen better performances from them. You know, MJF's had a handful of them this year alone. But like I said, for what this was designed to do, it worked for me. You know, I love the fact that MJF embellished every heel tactic in the book. I love the way he sold and fed for Ricky Starks in the early goings when Ricky got his moment of babyface shine. You know, the stuff with MJF flipping off the crowd and chucking popcorn in the air was fucking awesome. You know, I like the story of MJF working over Starks' previously injured body parts. You know, the rib area was a target early on. Eventually, he started working over his arms so he could apply the salt to the earth finish more effectively. You know, Starks did a great job selling the pain. The old classic Ricky Morton overselling that always gets over. You know, and again, as the match went along, the people were getting into the false finishes. The more Ricky hung in there with MJF and kept alive, the more the people reacted. Probably one of the rarest things you'll ever see in wrestling anymore is people popping for a rope break spot. That happened here. You know, MJF got the salt to the earth locked in, and Ricky's fighting with every limb to get to the ropes. MJF keeps trying to cut him off with a pass, and after catching both his arms and trying to tie up one of his legs, Starks is able to throw the other boot on the bottom rope to force the break. The people went nuts for that spot. When's the last time you actually saw people react that way to a rope break? Not in the last 20-some years. You know, they built to a great heat angle right at the end where Starks tried for the Rochambeau on MJF, but MJF cowered behind Paul Turner long enough to, when he got shoved aside, MJF could go low and kick Starks in the groin. Small package cradle, 1, 2, 3. Boom. Perfect. The heel wins, you know, but the babyface is left with an outing. Didn't beat him flat in the middle, so there's nowhere left to go after the fact. Now, if they ever want to revisit the program, Starks can hold that one over MJF's head and say, look, motherfucker, I mean, I had you beat until you kicked me low and stole the match out from under my nose, so I want my title rematch. Now, again, was the match picture perfect? No. Now, I particularly felt bad for poor old Ricky trying on multiple occasions to pick MJF for those power bombs, and God, every single time he went for it, he couldn't muscle him up far enough. So he ended up getting him about halfway upside down and then having to drop him back to his feet because he kept losing his grip. You know, and MJF's not that big of a guy either, so I don't know what the issue was for Ricky there. Whether it was nerves or maybe he just needs to hit the heavy lifting a little harder at the gym. But, you know, those are pretty noticeable, and it happened at least 3 times during the match, including the lead up to the finish. You know, but they covered their tracks and didn't overreact to anything, so that was good. And they called an audible, and more power to them. You know, everything's never going to run perfectly smooth during a wrestling match, so you always got to be on your feet for that. You know, and again, MJF getting the dirty win, and then segueing into the Bryan Danielson runoff at the end of the show, it was well done. MJF nearly tripping over the guardrail during the chase was funny too. It was one of those deja vu cases where you're just sitting there thinking, oh God, please don't let Max break his foot trying to jump the guardrail. He was fine though. And, you know, while I'm still not in favor of them going to this so soon without really giving the Starks-MJF feud more time to breathe, Danielson and MJF is a program that I would like to see. If anything, it'll be a way to rehabilitate Danielson after the shitty way he's been handled for the better part of 12 months. I just don't know why they felt the urge to rush into this so fast. I mean, they got, 3 months until the next pay-per-view? It's like, why rush it? You know, I think letting the Starks-MJF program play out a little longer headed into January would have been a better way to let this feud prolong and give Danielson a chance to get back on a better winning path. Now, they could always shoot an angle or something on television where MJF puts Danielson out of action for a while and they write him off that way. You know, but the only complaint I have about all this is that it just seems way too soon to be delving into MJF's next title program. But, you know, this is kind of the way Tony books. I don't get it personally. I think he'd be better off letting things simmer a little while longer, but whatever. Dare I judge the proclaimed 2-time Booker of the Year? But overall, it was a fitting ending to what otherwise would have been an all-time horrendous episode of Dynamite. The first hour and a half of this show was downright abysmal. If they had booked MJF and Starks on any other television show, I'd be pinning this one in the top all-time worst Dynamites list. And that's already a pretty long list to begin with. I mean, there have been a few bright spots here and there, but by and large, most of the Dynamites I've seen in 2022 have fallen under the category of lame to outright awful. And again, man, I'm trying to be honest in my review. You know, as somebody that understands what I'm getting with AEW at this point, I try not to harp on too much of the bad shit. But Jesus, man. I don't know how you look at a show like this and think that anything preceding the Starks-MJF match was anything good. Just one bad segment after another. I'd have probably preferred they opened the show with the Starks-MJF match if this was going to be the show they presented with everything prior. Or maybe I'm out of touch with the current wrestling market and I have no idea what good wrestling is anymore. Despite having watched this crap for well over 20 years now. Tell you what though, if this is good wrestling based on how we grade things in 2022, boy is that bar unimaginably low. All right, retro review series time. This is going to be NWA World Championship Wrestling from December 13th, 1986. And right at the top of the program, we are met with the groundbreaking news that Barry Windham and Ronnie Garvin are the new United States Tag Team Champions, defeating former champions Ivan Koloff and Crusher Khrushchev. A title switch that I remembered happened relatively soon, but I did not realize was within the very next week of me mentioning it on, I think, last week's review. And again, since Barry Windham has kind of been in the news over the last week, I wanted to take a quick moment to encourage anybody to check out Monday's podcast, where I briefly touched on that whole story and sent on my well wishes to the family, wishing a speedy recovery to Barry, and hopefully he's back on his feet soon. From there, we went to the ring for a Rock and Roll Express squash. They wrestled Brody Chase and Tony Zane. And of course, following up from last week's program, where Ricky and Robert dropped the World Tag titles to Manny Fernandez and Rick Rude. Obviously, they have their sights set on recapturing the titles. Once again, if you did not listen to last week's retro review, I encourage you to go check that out. That TV main event on last week's episode was really good. Definitely a match you want to go out of your way to check out. It was surely better than this match. Not to try and insinuate that Tony Zane and Brody Chase were inferior to the Raging Bull and Rick Rude as opponents, but, well, that's exactly what I'm saying, as a matter of fact. There's a spot they do here at the beginning where Ricky and Robert go to whip Tony Zane off the ropes, and they try to hit him with a double elbow to the gut. I've seen a lot of Tony Zane squashes on these studio shows. Like, he's not a bad worker. He's competent in the ring. I am not sure what planet Tony Zane was on here, but the bump he took for this basically looked like one of those slow motion movie scenes where a guy gets shot in the stomach and then he does like the big dramatic fall onto his back. That is what Tony Zane looked like when he took the bump for this move. Even Ricky Morton was looking at him like, you fucking numbskull. Now, of course, 1 week removed from the title match, Ricky and Robert were obviously still favoring some of those injuries. Most notably, Ricky's arm, which was still taped up here. Not that any of that mattered by the end, because Ricky and Robert still both beat their asses, both in the figurative and the literal sense. But this was good follow-up from last week, because they went to the booth after the match to let the Paul Jones Army know that sooner or later, the Rock and Roll is coming back to reclaim their tag titles. Well, in a way, they were right. Ended up being a phantom title switch, but I believe the belts wound up around Ricky and Robert's waist again in '87. Then we came back from the break for a Boogie Woogie Man promo, a.k.a. the happiest man Tony Schiavone knows. I think happy was underselling it. And he's also the new and improved Boogie Woogie Man, Jimmy Valiant, talking about how the issue with him and Paul Jones is in the history books. Paul Jones is a bald-headed geek, and now Valiant is turning his attention to bigger and better things. To which he then goes into a tirade about how he plans on winning the Bunkhouse Stampede so that he can buy all the good little boys and girls Christmas presents for the holidays. Boy, imagine explaining that story around the fireplace to the family. Remember that night Handsome Jimmy ripped open some dudes' heads with chairs so he could win a battle royal to buy all the kids Christmas presents? I mean, when you think about it for a minute, it is entirely believable that would be something Jimmy Valiant would do. I don't know how I'd feel about Valiant trying to shimmy his way down the chimneys with the whole Santa outfit on, but I mean, he's got the beard. He could pull off the look. So, well, it was a Jimmy Valiant promo. He also planted a big old wet kiss on Tony Schiavone before he left. Still fucking his name up after all these years. Never change, Boogie Woogie Man. So then we went to the ring where Nikita Koloff killed Alan Martin in about a minute. Beat him with the Russian sickle. I believe Martin landed directly on the back of his neck and folded up like an accordion, taking the bump. So that guy was dead. And then Nikita and Dusty were out for a promo after the break, wherein Nikita began to rapidly fire off promos on like 800 heels. He mentioned something about him and Dusty going after the World Tag titles by beating up Bull and Rude. Then he promised to cause Uncle Ivan a lot of pain. Then he challenged Tully Blanchard to come try and take back his U.S. heavyweight title, the same one that Tully claimed he never lost. And then he promised he was going to be the new World Heavyweight Champion when he beats Ric Flair in Philadelphia. To which I then said, "You think they got Nikita feuding with enough dudes?" And that was followed with Dusty doing one of his rambling, funky like a monkey promos to put over Nikita. I'm pretty sure at first he said fucky like a monkey. Somehow they were able to keep that on air without bleeping it out. And I'm going to be honest with you, I was not entirely convinced that Dusty did this promo while sober. Especially when he stopped mid-promo to say that Ric Flair would never be funky like a monkey, although he looks like a monkey. And I think Dusty even popped himself with that line because you could tell he was trying to hold himself back from laughing. Somehow during all this, Nikita also stood there and no-sold it. I have no idea how he pulled that off. He also called the two men in the ring funky monkeys. Those two men being Ole and Arn Anderson. As they were set to take on Randy Mulkey and Mike Samani. I guess Bill Mulkey was still playing dead after last week's match with Ivan and Crusher. Probably a blessing in disguise for him. Although maybe not, because he ended up getting killed by Tully Blanchard a few minutes after this. I did like during this match, the studio crowd tried to lead a chant to mock Ole and Arn, and of all things to chant, here's what they came up with. The Andersons are wimps. The Andersons are wimps. Doesn't really roll off the tongue, does it? It was also an outright lie. At no point in watching Ole and Arn decimate these two job guys did I think, man, Ole and Arn, boy, those guys are wimps. They massacred both of these guys for pretty much 5 minutes straight. I particularly enjoyed watching Ole illegally stand on Randy Mulkey's head while Scrappy was giving him the illegal 5 count. To which Tony and David merely responded with, "Boy, is he mad." You think? Tony and David always with the riveting commentary. And then finally Arn pinned Randy with the gourd buster. Then we came back for a Tully and JJ promo. And you know how I constantly talk about how great Tully and JJ were at doing promos? Remember how I always talk about how they're usually the highlight of the shows when it comes to phenomenal promo delivery? Well, this wasn't one of those promos. It wasn't bad. It was just kind of a generic Tully JJ promo. JJ mentions Nikita Koloff and says that him being the U.S. champion ranks him number 2 at best in the NWA, obviously behind Ric Flair. Says that he should be lucky he even has the U.S. title right now, because Tully should still technically be the U.S. champion, since he never uttered the words "I quit" in last year's cage match with Magnum TA. And if Nikita keeps trying to target the 4 horsemen, they're going to eventually knock him down the ladder back to the bottom. Then Tully basically said that everyone's trying to prove that they're the biggest and baddest in the NWA, when the reality is that in order to be the best, you have to be a horseman. And he was going to demonstrate that by beating the shit out of Bill Mulkey. And that he pretty much did. God damn, this match was so entertaining. It's for the TV title too, I didn't mention that. Not that anyone bought for a minute that Bill Mulkey was winning the title here from Tully. But God, Tully was so great. From the onset where he went to fake out Bill with the handshake, and then he's doing the whole paintbrush slap while he's playing the cat and mouse chase around the ring. And every time Bill went to try and give a lockup with Tully or grab a hold, he just get slapped in the face each time. And Tully's just laughing it off like a total dick. I was crying watching this match. We also had more dueling chants going on here. Audibly, I could hear things such as, "JJ is a wimp," and "Tully is a wimp." And I can't confirm this for sure, but I think there was a brief period where the crowd was chanting, "Tully is a cow." Maybe they were saying coward, and I just only heard the cow part. If in fact the fans were trying to call Tully a cow, I find that highly more offensive than them trying to refer to him as a wimp. Don't these lowlifes know anything about fat shaming? Even back in 1986, they should have known better. Actually, looking back, the studio fans were pretty good on this show. They were really giving the Horsemen a hard time. Sometimes you get those studio crowds where they're pretty pro-Horsemen. This was a good crowd for sticking behind the baby faces. They did not like the Horsemen. They did not like the four Horsemen during the set of tapings. And Tully obviously went over with the slingshot suplex. And when we come back from break, Tony and David show us footage of Barry Windham and Ron Garvin becoming the new U.S. Tag Champions. And it would appear that this happened on a recent NWA Pro taping from December 9th. They basically sold it as the upset win because Ronnie and Barry were basically thrown together as a makeshift team, but they still wound up winning the belts in the end. And the angle to set that up was done here, where Crusher tried to use the Russian chain on Garvin, but when he went to hit Barry with it on the ring apron, Barry ducked it, managed to hit Crusher with the sunset pin. And the abrupt title switch was interesting. I think they ended up doing this because they needed a set of babyfaces to eventually drop the belts to Bobby Eaton and Stan Lane when they end up winning the belts a few months later. So the title switch kind of makes sense when you look at the direction they were going in 87. Again, we talk about that monster push they were giving Barry Windham when he showed up here in 86. I mean, he was literally with Crockett Promotions for like 2 weeks as of this point. They immediately put a belt on him not too long after he showed up. Now, granted, it was pairing him in a makeshift team with Ron Garvin that never really went anywhere from my recollection, and they kind of dropped the belts unceremoniously by 87. But, considering where they were going with Barry by Crockett Cup time next year, I mean, this was a rocket ship push if I ever saw one. They wasted no time trying to get this guy over as a main eventer. Tell you what, it worked out better for him than it did Sir Timothy Horner. He wrestled Vernon Deaton, also back on the studio show, longtime fan, Dolores, who was a little camera shy when she found out she was being filmed. Poor gal. Or maybe she was just face palming for having to sit through a Tim Horner match. I kid. That was low. I'm sorry. Nah, he wasn't that bad. I like during this match, they actually took the time to edit in a graphic from Terra Stories, talking about how Tim Horner was one of the co-founders of Smoky Mountain Wrestling with Jim Cornette, Stan Lane, and Sandy Scott. But was that entirely true? Or was Tim just trying to attach his name to something successful? I mean, I know he was instrumental in some of the behind-the-scenes dealings with Smoky Mountain, but one of the co-founders? Historically, I don't think that's entirely accurate. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I'd like to hear Cornette's take on it personally. I mean, he's probably covered it before, but whatever. Anyway, this match went on for like 8 months. Horner just stretched and worked over Deaton forever. I believe we went through about several cycles of Nightfall before this match ever ended. And finally, Horner won with the bridging suplex. And if you have not been able to tell by now, I have very little to say about most of these studio squashes at this point. They followed that with Ric Flair out at the booth for a promo, sporting his version of a fur winter coat, only it was dark and tapered and actually looked good on him, as opposed to the one Dusty had on last week, where it looked totally out of place and just made him look goofy. Anyway, well, he really didn't have a whole lot to say. He plugged the Bunkhouse Stampede, said that while Nikita and Dusty were out here earlier trying to get funky like a monkey, Nikita's the one that should be watching his back, because little does he know that Dusty is talking shit behind his back, to which Flair then calls Nikita a muscled-up monkey. With all the name-calling going on with dudes referring to the other as monkeys, it's a good thing these guys are all Caucasian. Just saying. And, well, actually, the end of this promo was great because Flair's rattling off on all the towns they're going to be visiting, including Chicago and Philly, where I believe Flair would have his 2 big world title defenses with Nikita. And while he's talking about how it's going to be a night where the Horsemen all come out on top, He goes through everybody in the group, and I quote, Dylan, Blanchard, Ole, Arn, and the legendary J.J. Dillon. I guess just to make sure we didn't forget that he mentioned JJ's name. Gotta mention it twice. Well, he did say that he was legendary the second time, so maybe he was trying to correct himself. And, well, I think his point was that they rented out space at one of the hotels they were staying at so that they could party and fuck a bunch of girls. One of his lines being, none of you can be first, but a whole lot of you can be next. That is a fucking Dynamite pickup line. Then we came back for a Jim Cornette promo. He is back from successful ACL surgery. The first round. And boy, what a fiery promo this was. Stand there talking about those long, dark nights where he was laid up in the hospital bed. All he could think about was the Road Warriors and Paul Ellering and how much he wanted to get back at them for all the damage they caused, all the torment and agony they put Cornette through. And every time Cornette thought about the pain that shot up through his leg, every time he took a step, every time he thought about the surgeon standing over him in the operating room, all Corny wanted to do was get back at the Road Warriors. And he vows that the Midnights are out to return the favor to Hawk Animal and Ellering. They're going to get their revenge and end the Road Warriors for good. And by the time it was all over, I thought, you know, that was a really damn good babyface promo. Oops. So then we went back to the ring for a midnight squash. They wrestled Rocky King and George South. Oh, and while it's on my mind, I almost forgot to mention it. Baby Doll was nowhere to be seen this week. That one random cameo appearance she had on last week's show as interim manager for Eden Condrey. Apparently that was seriously a one-time deal. I also believe this is the first time I've ever seen Bobby Eaton in lime green tights. Hopefully it's the last. So one of the reasons the Midnights are one of my all-time favorite tag teams is their ability to always innovate on the spot and do all kinds of subtle things in their matches to put a smile on my face. I've never seen them do this spot before, but they do a deal where Eaton and Condrey are working with Rocky, and they only did it with him. They didn't do it with George at any point here. But they would go to do lockups with him, and then after they would break up the holds, they'd go to wipe their fingers or hands on the ring mat in disgust. I'm not sure if they were selling that as being repelled by Rocky using baby oil. Maybe it was sweat. But I've never seen them do that spot before in either of their matches, and they only did it with Rocky here. It was subtle, but it was so funny. Also on the topic of subtleties, David Crockett had a great moment here. During the match, Courtney's at the booth, ranting and raving about the Road Warriors, how they nearly destroyed his career when they threw him off the scaffold at Starrcade. He's going on this huge tangent about how Big Bubba is somewhere in the back, hunting down the Legion of Doom at the moment. And there's a brief pause, and when Cornette walks away from the podium, David Crockett under his breath goes, "It's too bad they didn't operate on his mouth." David was not the king of comedy when it came to delivering great lines. That was a great line. Another interesting note about this segment, too. Remember how earlier I was talking about how the studio crowd was pretty anti-Horseman on this show? Apparently this crowd was also very pro-Midnights at the same time. The dueling Road Warriors Midnights chants. Those are interesting. I would never have suspected a crowd could be anti-Horseman while at the same time being pro-Midnights on the same show, but lo and behold, these people were. Overall, it's a fun squash. They worked over Rocky for almost the entire thing. And then right at the end when George South went to get the hot tag, the Midnights immediately cut his balls out from under him and then put him away with the double backbreaker elbow smash. I was loving the job guys get cut off trying to milk a comeback after like 2 seconds. It's like the dorky kid in elementary school that tries to fire up on the jocks and then they immediately beat the shit out of him. You feel bad for the kid, but it's never not funny. So they cut back to the booth, and Cornette is now completely blown up and sweating profusely, and he's also managed to lose his voice. And in admitting so, he was able to get out a final word on the Road Warriors, promising that tomorrow in Chicago, Hawk and Animal's hometown, they're going to get shown up by Eaton and Condrey. Says that while Hawk and Animal were busy stealing bicycles in the streets of Chicago like two delinquents, Eaton and Condrey were beating up grown adult men. And tomorrow, the Midnights are going to humiliate the Road Warriors. Well, I guess we'll see about that. You know who's not going to humiliate the Road Warriors, though? Paul Garner and Clement Fields. Yeah, Hawk and Animal killed them in about a minute. And in the case of Clement Fields, when Animal decked him with the lariat at the end and then folded him up, I was not entirely sure he had a pulse going. He may still be sprawled out in Atlanta as we speak. And of course, while it's going on, David Crockett is marking out on commentary. Look at those guys. They're getting absolutely killed in there. Pure joy. I also marked out for their post-match promo. Animal just kind of fired up about being back in Chicago the following night. But I particularly enjoyed hearing Hawk talk about their road trip to Atlanta, where he said that they drove over 100 miles an hour, almost ran over 5 people, also they could show up in Atlanta and beat people up. That is how badly Hawk and Animal wanted to punch some dudes in the face. And again, I totally bought it. I would have loved to have seen some hidden cam footage of Animal and Hawk riding down the interstate at 100 miles an hour, nearly taking out innocent pedestrians. That could have been comedy. So that was a fun 2 minutes of television. If only we could get stuff like that more often in today's product. I probably wouldn't be so down on how shitty things are most weeks. So after that, came back for a Paul Jones Army promo. Roode and Bull sporting their newly won world tag titles. And they're laying out the challenge to any babyface team in the locker room that wants to step up to the plate and see if they can try to dethrone Roode and Bull. Roode says that the Rock and Roll Express were out here claiming that there's only one R&R in the NWA, and they're exactly right. And they're looking at him right now. When Robert's griping about how they were former 3-time champions, the only thing that makes them in Roode's eyes are 4-time losers. Bull mentioned that they don't make promises they can't keep, and whether it's the Road Warriors or the Superpowers, it doesn't matter who steps up. I believe he referred to Nikita here as Chiquita Banana, which might have been the funniest thing I've ever heard Bull say on this show. Says that R&R stands for Ravishing and Raging, and that's exactly what Bull and Roode are going to do to stay the NWA World Tag Champions. And while Bull is literally spitting everywhere, nearly choking on his own saliva, he also said something about how Roode and Bull are heavy metal, unlike those boring rock and rollers, to which I said, well, I usually prefer heavy rock over boring 70s rock music anyway. Call me progressive. So then Barry Windham wrestled Larry Stevens, which is another great quick showcase to put over Barry's athleticism. Without a doubt, he had one of the best Snapmare takeovers I've ever seen. And he ended up hitting Stevens with a great power slam off the ropes, followed that up with a big old lariat for the 3, to which David responded with, wow, he killed that guy. Indeed. And moving along right past that, we had a Ravishing Rude Manny Fernandez versus Randy Barber Pat O'Brien match. What ended up being my favorite match on the whole show, including Rick Rude's artificial WWE Network theme music. The single most generic fusion music you've ever heard in your life. In fact, it is so horrible, my first instinct when I heard it was, where the hell are we? Fucking Macy's department store? Like, who came up with that? I mean, I play some of the audio for you, but I don't want to get hit with a copyright strike. Trust me when I tell you, it's horrible. But you know what wasn't horrible? Rick Rude's abs. Those are quite on point. All 8 of them. It almost made up for Pat O'Brien's appearance. And I know it's always fun to go back and mock the way a lot of these job guys looked on the studio shows. Pat O'Brien might be among the worst looking of the job guys. Beyond the fact that he had no physique, he was also sporting the salt and pepper beard. And normally I'm all for like the gray beard look. Most guys look good with that, especially older guys. But when you factor in that A, he looked like shit physically, and B, his ring gear was also pretty hideous, the beard did not really make the overall look very appealing. But that didn't stop the people from running down Bull and Rude here. And we talked earlier, I can't remember which match it was, but I thought the studio fans were trying to start up a cow chant at one point. I think it was the Tully Blanchard match. And I talked about how I wasn't able to distinguish whether or not the fans were chanting cow or coward. Here it was pretty discernible. The fans were definitely chanting Ragin' Cow. And that, I've got to admit, that was pretty funny. But getting back to Pat O'Brien for a minute here, God was he atrocious in this match. The guy's only job for the most part was to literally go out there and sell and bump. And he failed at the latter task. They go to try things like whip him off the ropes or like drive him into the turnbuckle. Every single time Pat went to bump, he would do either one of those like Shawn Michaels lunging oversells where he would take a flip bump, or he would just spin in circles and then kind of fumble into random areas of the ring. Looked like a fucking fish out of water half the time he was in there. And he got more blown up the longer the match went, to the point where at one point, David Crockett outright says, "Bet you Pat O'Brien wishes Bull and Rude would put him out of his misery right now." Coded language. End this fucking goddamn atrocity. At some point here, O'Brien actually got busted open hard way at the bridge of the nose. I think Bull gave him a shoot punch coming off the second turnbuckle. Probably said, this guy's fucking earned this bloody nose. And finally, after the brutal mugging / butchery of Sir Pat O'Brien, Bull finally put him away with the flying burrito. To which my final note reads, Pat O'Brien is now my single new favorite worst job guy in all of Crockett Promotions history. We run the full gamut from Tony Zane to Lee Peak to name the guy. At one point I would have said the Mulkey brothers. Most of them are complete trash, but Pat O'Brien, he took it to a whole different level of suck. Hopefully we see more of him. I want to see him get in the ring with Nikita. So then we cut back to the booth for a Barry Windham interview. And whereas last week he really didn't have a whole lot of input after his TV debut, here he covered a little more ground. Talked about how he's proud to be one half the new United States Tag Champions with Ron Garvin. And he hopes that Bull and Rude are taking notice because they're after the World Tag titles next. Which obviously never panned out as expected, but, we already kind of covered that whole deal last week. He also laid out the early challenge to Ric Flair. He said that he came to Crockett Promotions to become the NWA World Heavyweight Champion, and all Flair has to do is name the time and place to get the match on. Also, side note here, again, not that this was a shocker for looking at things in hindsight, but seeing Barry Windham tower over Tony Schiavone at the booth here, it's quite the visual. I always underestimated how tall Barry actually was back in the day. He was a big boy. What do they call it? A tall drink of water, I think the old cliche goes. So, well, up next we had the other Garvin, Gorgeous Jimmy and Precious. They were out for a promo. And this is amazing. So, Garvin's out there ranting about the Armstrongs. He's going on a tangent about how Brad's a coward because after Garvin and Dundee had attacked Bullet Bob, in a segment that we never saw air on TBS, by the way. But the point was that Brad was nowhere to be seen on the studio to defend the family honor So pretty soon he starts turning his attention to calling out Dusty and Barry Windham, calling Dusty a douchebag for chomping on his gum and flapping his yap earlier on, saying that Windham has no business coming out on live television and belittling the Raging Bull and ravishing Rick Rude for their wrestling ability. Made better by the fact that Garvin actually forgot Rude's name during his promo, and Precious, of all people, had to remind Jimmy Garvin of what his name was, which he covered up pretty well because then he just went, well, it's hard to remember his name is Ravishing Rick Rude because there ain't a whole lot of ravishing about him. God, Jimmy Garvin was so great. He was such a heel, he didn't even like the other heels. And then he said that if Windham has any guts, he'd come out so Garvin could teach him a thing or two about wrestling. And then right before they went to the ring, he plugged the Bunkhouse Stampede and said, time to get a cardiovascular workout. And that apparently was going to come at the expense of Art Pritz, now spelled P-R-I-T-Z. I guess because spelling it P-R-I-T-T-S took too much time in the production truck. In any case. Oh, and I forgot to mention this from the promo. So, Garvin's doing his heel promo. Precious is spraying the aerosol can everywhere, obviously. In the studio crowd, of all people to chant here, who is the one person they are all cheering for? Baby Doll. What the fuck? Was that to try and shit all over Precious? Wasn't Baby Doll a heel the last time we saw her on television? All of 1 week ago? Yeah, the studio crowd was something else this week. So, at this point, I couldn't keep a straight face watching any of the matches on the show because the ring mat is just covered in dry blood. It looked like a literal war zone out there. Meanwhile, Gorgeous Jimmy's just in there doing basic takedowns and chain wrestling. Just big old smile on his face. Never mind the blood all over the ring mat. And David Crockett standing there with a straight face talking about how when you wrestle to win in the NWA, you're wrestling the best of the best. All the while, I'm watching Gorgeous Jimmy Garvin wrestle Art fucking Pritz. The best of the best. Hilarious. So Garvin ended up killing him with a brain buster. Made better by him screaming, "How was that?" at the very end. And David just goes, "Pretty good." Then we went to the booth for Ole and Arn. Ole did a super fired up, passionate heel promo. Says that Jim Crockett Jr. is doing everything in his power to keep Ole and Arn away from both sets of tag belts in the NWA. They're making a promise that at the start of the new year, they're going to make sure they get their hands on any of the straps, by hook or by crook. Also said that Dusty may still be alive, but mark his words, Ole is not leaving until he rids Dusty of the NWA altogether. Quite the omen from Ole right there. And then Arn just kind of talked in circles for a few minutes. I honestly don't remember anything he said. Something about the Andersons underestimating the Rock and Roll Express and something about how they're coming for Barry and Ronnie Garvin or something. So then we come back from break for a match already in progress. It is Handsome Jimmy taking on Big Bill Tab in his new ring gear where the tights read, "Honey and Money." And if I took the time to actually figure out what the hell that meant, I'd still probably be missing out on a few key details. I also like that he tried to infer that it was the new and improved Jimmy Valiant. Meanwhile, he wrestled every Handsome Jimmy match we've seen in the entirety of 1986. Where 90% of his offense is cheating and dirty heel tactics. And he also won with the goofy elbow drop. So much for the new and improved Jimmy Valiant. To be fair, I know he doesn't stick along all that long after this. That was followed with a Rock and Roll Express promo. where the only thing I wrote down about it is that Robert Gibson still can't cut a promo that is either comprehensible or audible. And Ricky Morton said something about how you can tune a guitar, but you can't tune a fish. Yeah, I don't know. They're coming back for the World Tag Titles. How about that? Ready to move on? Fuck, this show was long. Barbarian wrestled Robert Burrows. It went 2 minutes. I was not entirely convinced here that Burrows was not intentionally trying to sandbag Barbarian at all costs. Either that or he was one of those NWA jobbers that couldn't bump worth the shit. There was a spot where Barbarian Irish whipped Burrows off the ropes, and when Barbarian went to boot him in the face, Burrows basically turned 90 degrees to his left, tried to land on his side. I'm not entirely sure what he was doing, and I think Barbarian, in realizing that this idiot was fucking up left and right, decided to give him a shoot body slam on the concrete. Just to pay the receipt, I guess. I don't blame him. And finally, it ended with Barbarian giving him a running power slam and then hitting him with a diving headbutt. And mercifully, this long-ass show came to a close with the Four Horsemen doing a closing promo at the booth. Or I guess a better way to frame it would be Arn, JJ, Tully, and Flair did the bulk of the talking, and Ole just kind of stood in the periphery with his hands on his hips, looking totally dejected. Once again, sign of things to come. Arn actually did a much better promo here, saying that right now, Ole and Arn feel a little naked without sporting gold around their waist, but rest assured that they'll be getting gold around their waist sooner rather than later. Arn specifically name-dropped going after Nikita and the U.S. heavyweight title. Kind of put the tag belts on the back burner momentarily. And then Flair did one of his all-time late 90s Nitro rant promos where spouted off a bunch of crazy, incoherent psychobabble about a million different things, all of which was passionately boisterous, yet still great. Basically made fun of any person working a minimum wage just over broke job, said that the Horsemen beat up and do whatever they want because they have money and power. And after plugging all of his towns, he says that any woman that wants to jump on board is more than welcome. Yeah, pretty status quo Ric Flair promo. Girls, partying, drinking, fucking, lather, rinse, repeat. Did it for over 20 years, and he made a boatload of money off of it. Good on him. The only thing missing from this one was the limousine riding and jet flying. So we're sort of back to our regular TBS Superstation run times. The 90-minute programs seem to be back in full swing now, so there's definitely more to cover with the shows right now. And that's fine. You know, obviously they're kind of setting the early stages for 87, teasing some stuff headed into the Crockett Cup for next year. And they've already got Wyndham teasing the feud with Ric Flair for the world title, so keep that one in your back pocket. Generally, the show is hit and miss. Again, the squashes are what they are. You know, unless the job guys are just reprehensible beyond belief, I don't really have a whole lot to say about it at this point. You know, they really didn't have like a big angle or a big match like the last couple weeks, but that's cool. You know, not every show needs to be a memorable instant classic. Much like this episode of World Class Wrestling not being such a memorable classic. Now, of course, this was a post-taping from the Star Wars special that they aired over the last couple weeks. So you had to figure, you know, the following episode probably was mostly going to be a recap show, and that it mostly was. The main event was actually really good for this episode, but we'll cover that shortly. What they actually ended up doing was using the entire 45-minute program to basically build up to one match. I won't spend too long going over the opening deal. They showed a replay of the Junkyard Dog Iceman King Parsons versus Super Destroyers tag title match. And in addition to JYD coming off a few big appearances in the Dallas region at this point, you know, they had been milking the program with the Super Ds and the Iceman in previous weeks. And that all kind of came to a head here. They shot the big angle in the afterbirth where Skandar Ogbar had set the fireball to the Iceman King Parsons and burned his eye up real good. Of course, that was after the angle earlier in the match where Parsons got driven into the ring post and they tried to do the deal where they helped him to the back so they could tape up his bloody forehead, only to have him run out at the very end to save the match for JYD when he was in jeopardy. But the fireball angle was crucial for what they were setting up in the next segment. Because we go to Bill Mercer with Akbar and the Super Ds, and he's obviously trying to get some insight on what the reason was for Akbar trying to not only permanently injure the Iceman, but possibly end his career in the process. And of course, the General's got no regrets over any of his actions. Says that the Iceman meddled in his affairs, and he got what was coming to him. And he put the rest of the locker room on notice that if they try to do the same that the Iceman did, they're going to pay the price in full. At which point he tries to backpedal on Mercer's follow-up question on whether or not the General is going to be owning up to his word of dishing out the award for anybody that could body slam the Ugandan warrior Kamala. Now, if we remember from last week's Star Wars episode, Kerry Von Erich was able to do just that. So now Mercer's trying to see if the General will actually own up to that. Now, of course, we all kind of figured the answer would be fuck no. Tries to infer that Kerry sneak attacked Kamala from behind. So the deal is off. And of course, Bill Mercer, ever the insightful journalist, mentions that Akbar claimed whoever body slammed Kamala would earn 10 grand, but he never stipulated that it needed to take place during a sanctioned match. To which Akbar immediately cut him off and said, "Next subject." And of course, the final topic was Akbar putting over the Super Ds and mentioning that nobody in world class wants to get in the ring with them because they know they'll get hurt. All of which was a very well done segment. It's always fun listening to condescending heels. Like I talked about at the beginning of the show, they essentially used this as a precursor to set up the main event for later on, and that was all fine and good. At which point, we went to a gorgeous Jimmy Garvin squash with David Vines. Really not a whole lot to note about that particular segment. It was the first official time, I believe, on Dallas TV where they outright mentioned Precious by name. She had been referred to as an under-the-counter Sunshine bootleg for most of her appearances, but I believe this is the first time they actually referred to her as Precious on television. The other thing Mercer brought up here on commentary was that he had gotten word that there may be a rematch with Chris Adams and Jimmy Garvin. However, the stipulation is that if Adams wins that match, Precious has to spend 5 minutes in the ring with Sunshine. Alone. And as we noted from the first match Adams and Garvin had, the only thing that people were craving and foaming at the mouth to see was Sunshine to get her hands on Precious. The actual title match between the men was kind of an afterthought in the grand scheme of things. So we'll look to see if World Class ends up sanctioning the title rematch. And I love the follow-up interview here where Mercer's trying to run down all this with Jimmy. And of course, Jimmy's totally full of himself, totally self-assured that he'll walk out of that match with W. Meanwhile, Precious is standing there next to him going, "I don't know, Jimmy. I don't really like that stipulation." So you can already get a sense of where that's all going. But hey, they're keeping the feud hot. The payoff is seeing Sunshine rip Precious's head off. And even if that means that people have to sit through an American title match and no one gives a crap about, it'll be worth it in the end. Certainly can't wait for that. People were talking about how, girls, they really didn't draw in wrestling back in the day. Nah, that was a lie. They did draw. They just needed the right two girls to do it, and you really ain't going to find that in the modern product anymore, both in AEW or WWE. So with that said, we had a Buddy Roberts, Kevin Von Erich match, which I don't believe was a replay from a previous bout. It would just equate to somewhere in the ballpark of match number 587 between some combination of the Freebirds Von Erich pairings throughout 1983. It's, again, not really one of those matches that I wrote a whole lot of detail about. Buddy was back to sporting the headgear here, so the fans were immediately admonishing him with a "We want the wig" chants. There was a funny moment at one point where Kevin was wrestling Buddy on the mat, and when Buddy went to illegally grab Kevin's tights, Kevin goes, "Get off my trunks, Roberts, or I'll take your wig off." Very calm and collected in his delivery. Made the whole thing that much greater. And because Buddy had the headgear on, he was able to cut off Kevin momentarily by using his helmet illegally when David Manning wasn't looking. Led to a great moment where Buddy was stomping on Kevin on the ring apron, and right when Kevin took a spill out to the floor and basically shit-canned the camera, Bill Mercer, on point, goes, "Kevin had a little bit of trouble there." Well placed. And, of course, the heat lasted all of like 8 seconds before Kevin made his comeback and then won with the cradle package, or the small package, I guess. I believe that puts Buddy Roberts' win-loss record over the Von Erichs at somewhere around 2-97. Poor guy can never catch a break. They also stated that Michael Hayes had lost the cage match with Kerry, so as per their stipulations in the contract, Hayes was barred from working the Dallas territory for a full year. And historically speaking, I believe that would be the last appearance for Hayes in World Class until either 87 or 88. I can never remember which year. But I remember he would go to the AWA, and he worked there for a brief period around 84 or 85. Ended up having a brief stint down in the UWF for a couple years until winding back in Dallas at some point a few years later. But as of now, that was the last we would see of the original Freebirds pairing in World Class until several years later. So if any of y'all are sick to death of the Freebirds Von Erichs matches, well, you can take a breath, because you're going to get a break from that for a few years. It was surely beaten to death as a program throughout 83, and as much as it's fun going back and joking about it, you can't take it for granted. It was their number one main draw / money feud for their entire company history. That was where they did their great amount of business. It's kind of a sad state of affairs because we're kind of reviewing peak world-class television right now. By the time we get to 84, it's just kind of one slippery slope downhill after the fact. It was just the problem not ever really being able to top that program at any point. Kind of bit him in the ass. But it'll be nice to get a refresher and see the Von Erichs move on for the time being. And by then, it took us to our main event. The Super D's taking on the team of the Iceman and Kerry Von Erich. And after everything we had seen and heard from Skandar Akbar and his Super Destroyers, you can imagine how angry and pissed off the Iceman was heading into this match. Having his face burned, being humiliated and bloodied for the whole world to see. That dude's out for revenge. So he comes out hot right out of the gate and tries to take the fight to the Super D's. And while Bronco's trying to gain control and get everybody separated back to their corner, Kerry's trying to simmer down the Iceman, practically to no avail. And things kind of take a turn for the worst as the match rolls along. By the end, all four guys are in the ring just hitting each other with everything in the book. Meanwhile, Bronco Lubick, pulling from the AEW playbook of referee ineptitude, just standing around watching it all happen. And finally, after about 5 minutes of four guys just randomly doing shit in the ring, Kamala finally runs down for the blatant DQ. Made 10 times better by the fact that shortly after the run-in, as I wrote here in my notes, a man in a purple polo finally hits the ring, and he starts going after the heels. At first, I had no idea who this unidentified man was until Bill Mercer had mentioned it was Brian Adias, a man that I could not recall the last time I saw on Dallas television, and he just randomly showed up here to try and run off the heels at the very end. We also had other guys clear out from the locker room, and the whole thing basically turned into a glorified street fight, which was finally put to bed when David Manning got on the microphone and basically called for everyone to get back to the locker room and clear the building. But by that point, half the building was littering the ring with garbage too. It actually made for a cool, chaotic visual at the end there. And regardless of the fucked finish, they still went out with a bang, as the Iceman and his ketchup-inspired scarring above his eye mentioned that he wants the Super Ds. And Kerry Von Erich said something to the extent of the following: I want my $10,000 from Skandar Akbar, and if I don't get it, I'm going to kill someone. Sounds like a threat to me. Needless to say, he never specified who that man or woman was that he was going to kill. But, yeah, stay clear of Kerry Von Erich until he gets his 10 grand, folks. You wouldn't want to be caught in the middle when he's out for blood. Oh, yeah, and Brian Diaz was also there, just kind of standing around. Very useless. But, yeah, that was a world-class episode for this week. Again, mostly all of it centered around King Parsons' ongoing beef with Devastation Inc. You know, they set a lot of that up in the beginning of the program with showing the replay of the first match they had where they burned the Iceman. So it all tied well together by the time the main event rolled around. Clean finish be damned. The Iceman was purely out for Akbar's head. He didn't give two shits about the American tag titles, and quite frankly, why would he? After being burned in the eye with a fireball, I probably wouldn't care about any tag belts either. And, you know, it led to a hot ending, too, at the very end of the show. You know, the rest of the stuff in the middle was just kind of there to fill the void. But, you know, the story advancement was well done in a lot of key areas. I think everyone's looking forward to the rematch with Adams and Garvin for the American Heavyweight title. Not really for having anything to do with the actual title match, but everything to do with Sunshine and Precious getting into another cat fight. Only this time, it'll be sanctioned. Buckle up, folks. Can't wait for that one. So real quick before we wrap everything up here, let me just kind of run this down. I've talked about it briefly in passing, but I'll kind of mention it again. I am going to do a special recording for an FSWR episode within probably the next week or so, looking at my calendar, and I'm just going to call it like a featured end-of-the-year show. My plan right now is just to kind of analyze the year of wrestling in 2022 and give my overall take on the ups and downs of what I've seen this year. You know, we've seen a lot of stuff go down between both AEW and WWE, but now's the chance to kind of pick apart all the particulars and cover all the real groundbreaking stories. You know, give me a chance to kind of follow up with certain details or things that maybe I didn't spend a whole lot of time touching on when they were first breaking. But I'm also going to be running down my top 20 matches of the year. You know, I've spent a great deal on my podcasting run this year talking about how horrible the product's been for the most part, because let's be honest, it has. You know, but there have definitely been some upsides, and I don't want to leave those out of the conversation. You know, I have a list that I started back in January of this year to try and hand select my personal top matches of the year. I've been able to weed it down to about 20. And I think last I checked, my list had something like 24 or 25 on that list, so 20 is good enough for me. I don't expect there to be any more bangers between now and the end of the year, so I'm sure the list will stay as it is. And, you know, I'm going to break down and analyze those matches once we record the show. Some of them I'm actually going to kind of go back and refresh on because I haven't seen them in a while. But you can stay posted for that. It'll kind of be a long conversation, but I believe we did something to that similar last year where I just kind of went down the list, talked about the matches that I saw as the standouts of the year and everything that dated all the way back to January. Just a little thing I wanted to do is a special video for the end of the year. My work schedule is not going to be as hectic. You know, I'll still be working, but the stress level won't be as high. Holidays are usually a down period anyway, so, you know, I'll have some time to actually sit down and work out everything and put something together in a timely manner. You know, there are other things I'm looking to invest in for the new year, too. It's a small channel. You know, the incremental growth has been noticed, but, you know, we haven't really lit the world on fire or anything like that. And partially that's my fault for the formatting of the podcast. I know that if I had extra time to really piece together something real quality, I would go out of my way to do so, but I don't know. My microphone's a piece of junk, so maybe that's a good place to start. I just don't want to spend a great deal of money into something that I know I'll probably instantly regret 5 to 10 years down the road. Can't make a promise that I'll still be doing this 5 to 10 years down the road, but as long as I still have the passion to keep talking about wrestling, I'm going to keep at it. So with that said, stay posted for that holiday special last week of December. And for Monday, I'll be back to the regular formula of Retro Raw and whatever in the fuck SmackDown decides to vomit out on television Friday night. Hopefully it's not curdled milk. So take care, all. Peace out.